Hello from Westeros.org. This is Elio, and this is the same evening. It's now raining, in which I did the population video that I released the every week or the every day, and I said I'd do a related topic, and that's just simply a very basic discussion of relative military strength of the various regions. It's very quick because George has. We have some strong figures like the Reach, about 100,000. That's a massive amount of troops. That makes them, as George said, they are just clearly number one military strength. On top of that, they have one of the largest fleets, thanks to the Red Wines. The Red Wine fleet is ridiculous. I think it was many warships, many merchant galleys and ships and so on. One thing when people discuss military figures for some areas like White Harbor and so on, they don't think of the fact that, hey, if you've got people employed as sailors and oarsmen, you can't employ them also as soldiers in general. 100,000, biggest, strongest military strength in the Seven Kingdoms. Then you've got the Westerlands, and they're basically number two. They've got they're the wealthiest. The Lannisters and their vassals are the wealthiest lords in general in the Seven Kingdoms. And I would, from the various figures we've had, I would place their strength at about 50,000 strong. When they're kind of collecting everything, basically. And George has mentioned with them in particular, for example, the pike that are trained at Lannisport are known to be quite disciplined. In other words, because of the wealth that they have, and because of the Lannisters, Tywin being the hybrid, he's made sure that some of that wherewithal is used towards training his forces more often. If you look at the history of medieval cities, when they trained their levies, they would collect the various men who were, by day, masons and merchants and so on, and they would train together. And in particular, if you look at, for example, the lowlands, Flanders, the areas where you started having disciplined infantry that are capable of fighting off noble trained cavalry. They trained in pike formation. The Swiss is a great example. So tough troops in the Westerlands and second largest, but far smaller than what the Reach does, for example. Now George said back in the day that he kind of basically placed the Vale and Dorne and the North all together, strength-wise. Now, I find, so that was, when he first said that was a time when he said that Dorne, we had the figure in the Clash of Kings that Dorne had a strength of 50,000 spears. So now you go, oh, does that mean the North has 50,000? And the Dorne has 50,000, the Vale has 50,000, give or take? But at the time when he said it, I believe he had just finished Storm of Swords and he was starting on Peace or Coast. Did he already realize that Dorne was in fact not that strong? Was that an idea he always had and he just wasn't telling us? So when he gave us that figure in a mail, was he thinking, this man will think they are all at 50,000, or did he not think about it? I tend to think, given what now the World of Ice and Fire says, and given what I've discussed in the earlier video, but the North is at about 35,000, give or take. The Vale, about the same. And Dorne is actually less. It's about 25,000 strong. Maybe 30,000 if you're being generous. So there's definitely a tire under there. Now, the Riverlands, an area that George is always kind of confusing about, in my book. By all rights, it ought to have more strength than is obviously apparent. The solution to this problem is to suppose that, unlike the North, the Riverlands really does have a lot of unremarked strength that has, because of the fact that Edmure, that its leadership was sort of weakened, and Edmure then spread everyone out, and that they got steamrolled by the Lannisters. They were never able to sustain a significant army during the War of the Five Kings. Looking at the size of the place, looking at the size of the Westerlands next to them, looking at the fact they've got these rivers and they're pretty fertile. You would think it would be something near the sort of 45,000 mark all by itself. even if that's true, that just means they have this untapped, unfocused strength that they've never really been able, at least in the time of a Song of Ice and Fire, to bring together into a significant force. Logistics plays so much into it as well. You think, again, the logistics of having, you know, these rivers as these highways to bring things along would make it a lot easier, but it's been divided, and the history of Riverlands has been as a sort of the battleground, you know, the red-headed stepchild of everyone else. Everyone will also come and beat it around. If people had issues, they'd come and end up fighting in the middle of the Riverlands, you know, because that you know, their fighting was spillover and so on. So it's hard to get a really good figure. We have the best figure we have is by the time when Edmure is fighting at the Red Fork. He's called people hastily to fight off the Lannister attempt to cross Red Fork. I think it was 13,000. Obviously, there has to be more than that. Some of them were off of Robb, but I think there have to have been more in other areas that simply were too far away, or she was unwilling to call, or some other factors, really. Alternatively, I'm wrong, and that really is representing the maximum Riverlands strength. I think you're talking 20, 25,000. It makes no sense to me, really. But it may have something to do with the way that the Riverlands are organized, unlike other regions. Maybe it's a sign that the Tully power is quite weak, and they aren't able to command and force their bannermen to put that many resources into so many men. The Vale I covered. The Crownlands. Now, the Crownlands, again, they got the fleet, the royal fleet, which is largely drawn from the Houses of Dragonstone, which is one of the largest fleets in Seven Kingdoms. But it's not that big of an area, and when you look at some of that area is Crackclaw Point, which is quite sparsely populated. I would think it'd be lucky to see 15,000 troops from there. Now you would say, oh, but where were these 15,000 when, you know, they were defending King's Landing? Well, the other thing is because of the chaos, it does seem quite clear that a lot of the marginal lords out in the margins of the Crownland region kind of just stayed home and hid and kind of like let the fighting wash over them. You know, no one talks about the Lord of Duskendale bringing down his troops to defend King's Landing, right? It doesn't happen, even though he's a vassal, and one of the more significant vassals in the Crownlands. He doesn't do it. So now the story that George is quite dismissive about. He says basically there's a lot of rain and wood and rock. If you look at a medieval Germany area, and you look at the strength Renly had, I mean, Renly had claimed he had something like 80,000 or almost 100,000, and the vast majority were from the Reach. Excuse me. From the Reach. I would guess the storyline is probably somewhere in a 25,000 area. Then this leaves the Iron Islands. Now, the Iron Islands, unlike any other area, has quite a different social structure, social form. They've got the thralls, right, who do a lot of the manual labor. And they have a society that has this ethos of reaving and raiding, which is dying. But the idea that there's such social value in owning a ship, right? Everyone's a king on his own ship. So there's a lot of social weight given to being a captain. I mean, when there's a king's moot, you know, it's the lords and it's the captains, men who command a ship. And I imagine even someone who's got like a fishing ship or a trading ship counts. But because the Iron Islands has this sort of relative impoverishment, sustaining so many ships must be almost impossible unless a lot of these guys really are sneaking off and doing a bit of raiding and reaving. Not at all of a scale, for example, during Duncan Egg's period of Dagon Greyjoy, but there has to be quite a lot of slightly shady stuff going on for them to sustain that. We have a figure claimed that the fleet in A Feast for Crows, after it takes the Shield Islands, has a strength of 1,000 ships. That's dismissed as an overstatement. I think it's actually an overstatement. I think that's too much. But I think of an overall fleet size of 500 ships, which is anywhere from 2.5 to 5 times larger than any other fleet, is probably not wrong. Now, the thing is these are mostly long ships. The vast majority would be the long ships, not the large hybrid long ships of the Iron Fleet, right? Which would count to about 100 ships. But the long ships more along the lines of the Scandinavian. And some of these are quite small. They might have a crew of 20, 24 men. They were quick, small raiding craft. I suspect the vast majority of the fleet amounts to about that, and I would guess that the fighting strength of the Iron Islands, given the fact that they've got their thralls, given the fact that they have such an emphasis on reaving and fighting and keeping alive those old ways, even if it's dying, but trying anyways, I think they probably have more strength than that 1% rule of thumb really works with. I would guess, I don't know, 15,000, give or take. Again, they don't fight on horseback. They don't like archery. They don't have plate armor, the vast majority. They're not very disciplined, but they're foot fighters. I suppose they'll do a shield wall, the old sort of Viking thing. But it's still a larger figure proportionally than in other regions. It's my guess, and it fits roughly if you kind of look at it the right way, what the military strength of the Iron Islands looks like. Again, at the end, the Reach is by far the strongest. It's got a lot of strength, and Westerlands is number 2. After that, it starts getting a bit muddled. And you think, oh, how come the Reach didn't manage to conquer everything else when it was, back in the day? But, you have to remember, back in the day, they had people to 2 different kingdoms to the north of them, the Westerlands and the Riverlands, which were for a while under the control of the Ironborn. Then you had the Stormlands off to the east, and you have the Dornishmen down to the south. They, presumably, whenever they fought to try and beat someone in one direction, they had someone else bothering them in another direction. They could never quite break out. It's sort of like you would look at medieval France, which in theory could have all this force gathered, but then they had England they had to deal with, and they had issues with the after the Holy Roman Empire. They had Spain to deal with. So I think I'll leave it at that, and we'll see when we get another video out.